Hello everyone, welcome back to the Content Table tutorial series. So today we're going to talk about how to format an Excel spreadsheet to be compatible with ContenTable. Alright, so we have our Excel document right here. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this sheet. So if you remember last time, we created a object or a scriptable object called building definition. So we're just going to call this buildings. That'll just make it easier later. That's not a necessary step. Alright, so let's talk about rows and columns. So first things first, in ContenTable, the top row is the header. The header is going to contain the names for all of the columns in our sheet that we'll use to identify the columns so that we can match them to the fields in our scriptable object later. So every header in ContenTable needs to have one column, and it can be any column, though I personally like to put it in the first column here, called location. So the location column, and I'm going to make this a little wider, you'll see why here in a second. The location column contains the names of all of our scriptable objects, all of our individual items that we want to create with ContenTable. So in the case of our buildings, let's say we had building underscore headquarters, building underscore barracks, building underscore factory, and building underscore lab. So in our game we have a headquarters, we have a barracks, we have a factory, and we have a lab. Alright, so each row represents one content object, one item. The columns are going to represent the fields in the, and let me go ahead and make this bold real quick. The fields in our items. So if we go back to our code here, we have a name ID, we have cost to build, we have hit points, we have an array, prerequisites, and that's going to get a little bit complicated. And then we have our enumeration that we have defined up here. So let's go back here. So we're going to say name, we're going to have cost, we're going to have hit points, we're going to have prerequisites, and we're going to have type. Let's get these all sorted out. And something before I go any further, I should specify, notice how the names here don't necessarily have to be identical to the names here. You can name these whatever you want, just so long as you remember what you named them and you know, so that you can match them up later. Alright, so here we're going to say this is headquarters. And so, oh, sorry, I forgot to explain. So this is a string. This value is a string, so it doesn't really matter what we type here. Any value that can be stored in a string in C# is perfectly fine. So that's okay. This is in our code, it is an integer. So in the case of an integer, it has to be an integer that you enter into here. So 1 is a valid value. That's a little clumsy of a phrasing, but 1 is an acceptable value. 1.5 is not an integer. That would be a floating point or a double. And so this would cause an error if you tried to run this through ContenTable. So basically, when working with primitive types, just use common sense. If it can't be parsed to that primitive type, it wouldn't work. So for an integer, you wouldn't do 1.5. For a Boolean, you wouldn't put C in there. Just make sure that it is an acceptable value for the type that you're trying to parse it to. So same thing here with hit points. So now we get to arrays, and this one's actually a little bit, I apologize, this example is a little bit complicated. I couldn't think of one that wasn't super contrived, so this one's a little bit complicated. What we have here is both an array, a collection, and also a reference to a scriptable object. Alright, so let's start with arrays. So the way an array works, and I'm actually going to go down to this one because I think it'll illustrate my point better, is the way an array works is the first cell up here is going to be the size of the array. So this one is just going to be 1. And I'm going to insert a row, and I'm going to move that up there. Alright, and so every cell below the size cell that you put at the top of your array is going to contain the contents of the array. So in this case, we only have one cell to worry about. But this cell is going to be, let's say, well, it's going to be, so if this were like an integer or a floating point, if it were a floating point, you just put whatever number there. But since this is a reference, the way you reference a scriptable object, and we're using building definitions here, so we're just going to be pulling from our own list here. We're just going to type the name of the content object, or excuse me, scriptable object. It doesn't necessarily have to be a content object. We're going to type the name in here without the .asset suffix, the file extension, I mean. And so referencing assets is pretty simple. If my assets were being, if my scriptable objects were being stored in, say, a subfolder called buildings, or buildings, plural. So if it was an asset/building/building HQ, it would be here. So basically, it's just going to be the path minus the final extension from the assets folder. I'm not going to put it in a subfolder for now because that would require me to get into the settings menu, and that's further down the line. Anyway, so factory will do 1 there, and then we'll do that, and I'll go ahead and insert the row there. All right, and we can I'll just go ahead and fill these out for the time being. All right. So we have everything but the type now specified. Oh, I almost forgot this one. So since there's not going to be a prerequisite for building HQ, we're just going to make that 0. All right, now let's talk about the type. So to do an enumeration, you just type the value in the enumeration that you want to use. So our headquarters is going to be a military building, as is our barracks. And something that you may have noticed, just as an aside, is that not every cell in the location column needs to contain a location. So don't worry about these blank spaces. That's perfectly fine. All right, so this one is going to be factory, and this one is going to be research. All right, and something you may have noticed is I'm not bothering with being consistent with my capitalization. And that's because ContenTable does not care. ContenTable does not care about capitalization, so if you want to do your enumerations in like derp case or whatever, that's fine. Though I personally like consistency, so I'm just going to fix that real quick. Another thing is if you were to have an enumeration that you want to split into multiple terms. So let's say instead of research, it was research facility. You could also put spaces in your in this field, and ContenTable will strip those spaces out before it reads the tries to match it to one of your enumeration values. So the last thing I want to tell you about are comments, row and column comments in ContenTable. So when creating a sheet like this, if you put in the first column or in the header row, you put an item that starts with a pound sign, then that tells ContenTable to ignore the entire row or column, depending on whether or not it's in the first column or in the first row. And it doesn't have to be just a pound sign either. If you wanted to say comment or whatever, that would also work. Just so long as it starts with a pound sign, it's fine. So this is great if you want to have a row that is for certain not going to be read by ContenTable, or a column. So if I wanted to, I could put notes here, and this column will not show up when we open ContenTable and we see all of the columns in our sheet. Alright, and that's how you make a ContenTable ready spreadsheet. Anyway, so that concludes this episode. I hope to see you in the next one, and thank you very much for watching.